Welcome to episode 7 of Sustaining the Herd, brought to you by Sechi Agri-Services and Engineering. I'm your host, Brock Vitek, joined by my co-host, Andrew Wadle. It's great to be back with you all today after a couple of weeks since last time. As always, our goal for our time together is to explore innovation and sustainability in the agriculture industry, with a particular focus on animal agriculture. Today, we're honored to have a special guest with us as we're joined by Anna Kobza. Some of you may have heard of Anna, while she might be new to others. Here shortly, I'll pass the mic to Anna to introduce herself, but I'd like to share a few words before that. I don't know Anna particularly well, but we've been acquainted for a few years by way of her fiancé, who I consider to be a close friend and colleague. You'll soon find out that Anna wears many hats and knows a lot about a lot of things. She's a trailblazer in her own right, and we're excited to have her here today. Anna, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Brock. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're really glad to have you.
Yeah, so I am a Nebraska native. I'm from a small town in eastern Nebraska called David City. I grew up there. I didn't grow up in ag, but I very much grew up in a rural community surrounded by people who were involved in agriculture, and eventually found my way towards pursuing a career in ag. And I attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for my undergraduate degree, and I studied animal science there. And during my time as an undergraduate, I started to explore social media and entrepreneurship in social media. And that at that time is when I started my social media platforms on Instagram, advocating for agriculture and specifically advocating for the beef industry. And that's something I maintained throughout the years as I left the university to get a master's at West Texas A&M. My master's there was focused on largely feedlot nutrition. And then I actually, a year and a half ago, when I graduated, decided to come back here to the University of Nebraska and get my PhD. And so right now I do a lot of research. I run a lot of our digestibility research that we do here at the university. And then I also, when I have the time to, I like to still use my social media pages as well.
That's great. You've really had a lot of experiences, it sounds like, a lot of education, a lot of industry experience, and very well-rounded individual. I'm curious, Anna, it's clear through all of these experiences, like you've had many roles, and it sounds like you still find yourself in a lot of roles today. But throughout all of that, what remains constant?
It's a great question. I mean, the biggest constant for me is that no matter what I'm doing or what specific role I'm playing, it all revolves around the beef industry in some way. Even on social media, all of that revolves around ranching and cattle feeding. What I do here at the university on a day-to-day basis involves taking care of cattle that we do research with on a day-to-day basis. When I leave for the weekend and go visit Kane on the ranch, we're doing ranch work. It involves cattle in some capacity. So I guess cattle, in a sense, are my constant, no matter what kind of hat I'm wearing. It's just in very different ways.
Hey, Anna, we're really grateful for all of our guests, and they're all pretty highly credentialed. And I think it's really important for our listenership to know that, you're what we would like to call these days an influencer, correct? And that you're spreading the word about agriculture to the public.
Sure. Yeah.
And with that, Anna's work has kind of gone nationwide, so to speak, and attracting the attention of national news outlets, and that you were on Fox News Digital to kind of talk about the work that you've done. And so Anna cuts a pretty wide swath, so to speak, when it comes to spreading the good word about agriculture. And you've mentioned in some of your work that people fear what they do not know.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes in our podcast we kind of refer to the people in town, and the people in town are largely the people who have fear about agriculture and the things and the practices and whatnot that happen. And so the work that you're doing is fantastic. And we'd like to, continue with that and get some of the good word out of what you're doing. And so, as you started getting into this, your role as getting the word out and influencing agriculture, was there some specific issue that you saw or experienced that said, that is something that the people in town need to know about,
mm-hmm.
or just to get some more clarity about it, or make it so it's not so scary?
Yeah, well, when I first started, it was originally kind of just a passion project of trying to connect the people in town, as you say, to agriculture. And it was very broad, and that it involved kind of all of agriculture in a sense. And it really started with my own experience in our local county, where the number of kids involved in 4-H was really declining over the years compared to what I'd seen my siblings experience in their times in 4-H. And so I just realized that there were less and less people involved in ag, and I started using social media as a way to share it with people. And I would say that is how I portrayed myself and ag online early on. But as I progressed through school, and particularly in my master's, I started to focus specifically on the cattle feeding sector, because that was one, what I knew most about, and two, what I was most passionate about and what I was doing on a daily basis. And so something I had the opportunity to share. And that was probably the best move that I made, because I realized that of all the ag influencers that were coming online, there were plenty of people showcasing the ranching way of life or the cow-calf way of life. And there was quite a few vets online sharing things like that. And there was a lot of farmers online. A lot of farmers have been doing YouTube and social media platforms for a long time. But there was really kind of a gap in content creators online that were producing content that focused on promoting the cattle feeder and sharing the truths of the fed cattle industry. And so that was kind of the void that I felt I was filling, and that I'm still filling to this day. I think that there is definitely a disconnect with consumers and producers, but the more time I spend online and the more I see interactions between producers within the industry online, I realize that there's also some miscommunication and debates and disagreements between producers in our own industry, particularly commercial operations and direct to consumer operations. So that's been an interesting dynamic that I've been observing for the last year and a half or so.
Excellent. And so really it's just been a matter of all the areas in agriculture that are being represented, so to speak. It's just that the cattle feeding industry specifically is something that just hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And maybe because it's not quite so glamorous as big green tractors, big red tractors, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always say that it's a lot easier to make life on a ranch look very glamorous and beautiful. You've got the green grass and the rolling hills and horses. It's a lot harder to make a dirt pen look glamorous. So it's very challenging, and it is very challenging to discuss this part of our food system, the final stage of those animals' lives, in a way that's tasteful and approachable and consumable for people.
Anna, it seems that everyone from consumers to producers and everybody in between has their own definition of sustainability these days. In your experience, how can we find common ground to collectively maintain a commitment to sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's hard, because even though we exist in the same industry, we all have our own challenges that we face in our day-to-day operations. That's unique to where we're at, how we grew up, and what we raise, whether that's cattle or crops or maybe something entirely different. I think that coming together collectively, I think it requires a lot of empathy and compassion for each other, because we have to realize that our problems are not everyone else's problems, and our versions and definitions of sustainability are different as well, based on maybe the resources that we have or the size of our operations as well. What I think the most important thing to agree upon as producers is that sustainability is not just about the environment. It's a very important component of it, but you also have to consider economic sustainability and social sustainability. And I think if we can all agree on those things, then we can work a lot better towards achieving quote unquote sustainability as a whole. But those are three very separate things that make up sustainability, and that each need to be paid attention to individually.
Absolutely. It's not a one-sided issue at all. And something else I'd like to ask, Anna, you're working on your PhD, you're a scientist. So when you're in your research and in your educational work, how has your perspective on this question or this issue changed over the last few years as you've pursued more education and training?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely, a lot of what grad school is not just getting the answers; it's learning how to search for the answers, and do the research. And that's been a very valuable skill that I'm still working at, and not something that everyone is exposed to. And why I think people are very naive or willing to accept information without asking further questions. And I think what's also important to note is that we need to approach these conversations about sustainability with nuance. It's not black and white. There's a lot that goes into it. And if we can all just realize that and acknowledge that, our conversations around sustainability are usually a lot more productive.
Definitely.
Yeah, it seems like on the subject of sustainability, oftentimes people tend to forget that very often the cattle feeder lives in the same town that his cattle feeding operation is in. And so he's breathing the same air. He or she, their families they're drinking the same water. They just so happen to be eating the same meat. And so it would be very, very counterproductive for someone to not be keeping all of these things in mind as they go about and making decisions. And you raise a really good point on the matter of economic sustainability. And this is something that the people in town, have a harder time coming to grips with, because but you really don't have to look any further than, say, you're going to buy nuts and bolts. Very often, it used to be the days you go to the small hardware store to buy the nuts and the bolts, and whereas now you would tend to go to the larger box stores, and it just seems to be a natural progression of things, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked to influencer Anna a bit, and so I'd like to switch to scientist Anna, and it just so happens that the scientist piece does kind of fit into the sustainability piece, because we know if we feed cattle more efficiently, well, that is just part of this great sustainability message that is all about cattle feeding. So, and I think Anna, that we have a pretty interesting listenership. We have the people in town. We have agricultural professionals. We have people involved in production. But if you were to just giving some information to the cattle feeders, where do you see the advances coming in terms of nutrition, and where are the gains that you think can be had?
Yeah, I think we're constantly improving just upon using the feed sources that are already available to us in terms of nutrition, playing with different inclusion rates and maybe modifying the feeds that we have with different ingredients a little bit at places like the ethanol plant or things like that. But I think there's a lot of opportunities that are coming down the road that still need a lot of research done in the feed additive space, and how those help us improve overall efficiency and productivity in the feedlot. But of course, a lot of the things we do nutritionally also have a big advantage combined with different technologies that we use. So things like implants have been one of the best technologies that we've used to improve our efficiency in the feed yard. When you have good technology and good nutrition, when you combine those two, it makes it all the better. And that's, I think, really advantageous for us as an industry, and something we will continue to work at and continue to do better at, even amidst different regulations that might be placed on us. We've experienced that with the new implant regulations, and how we are able to use implants in the feed yards has changed recently. Different feed additives that we might be able to use might also change in the future. So how do we adapt to feeding cattle without those kinds of things? So I think it's important not just to know what more we can do with those resources, but what happens if they're ever taken away? How do we still maintain productivity and efficiency?
Right. And a follow-up to that would be, when it comes to implants, say, how do you help the people in town reconcile the fact that implants are safe?
Yeah. So, I mean, my approach to that is maybe different than some people's approach. I know there's a largely negative perception on what growth implants are and how they're used in beef cattle and in our food system. And I understand that. And I know there are organizations that don't like to discuss growth implants because of the negative perceptions that exist and the resistance that they're met with when they do talk about them. But I guess my personal approach, whether it's as a scientist or as a social media influencer, is to tell them all the information, whether they like that information or not. At the very least, I can give them all the information, the entire truth, without leaving anything out, and they can't say that I tried to hide anything from them. But I always try to discuss when I'm talking about these things, yes, how we're using it in a production setting and how it improves our efficiency. But I think most of those people are more concerned about how it affects their end product and what ends up on their plates. And I understand that and I empathize with that. And so I do point them to the research that shows the difference between implanted and non-implanted beef and how it doesn't change the hormone concentrations. And I just try to provide the perspective that there's hormones in every living thing. It's not just beef, and it's not just because we put it there with an implant pellet. So I think it's important for them to understand that. Maybe they're missing some other information regarding hormones in our food. Um, Lots of soy products are very high in estrogen and things like that. So beef is not the only thing with hormones in it. A lot of things we eat have hormones in them. So I think it's just important for them to understand that. And usually, when a lot of people find that out, they're a lot less concerned about it. But definitely is a shocking realization for some people that I've talked to about it.
Yeah, I think a real biggie is just kind of what you briefly mentioned there, is that I think estrogenic activity is what oftentimes kind of bubbles up, and tofu, for instance, is many, many, many orders of magnitude greater than beef or eggs or many, many different things. So that's great. Definitely appreciate the fact that that you're getting into these issues and not pretending that they're not there. They're there, and it's just better that we talk about them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anna, switching gears a little bit once again, and forgive me if you've talked a little about this earlier, but would you be able to tell us a bit about your research that you're doing in your PhD program?
Yeah. So my research specifically has focused on supplemental fat and feedlot diets. So we commonly feed fat and feedlot diets to increase the energy density of it without having to increase the starch content from sources like corn. And that has been common practice for several cattle feeders until recently, when the cost of fat has gotten significantly higher in the last couple of years, and that is because of the increased production of biofuel. So those biofuel producers, they use the fat sources that we use, things like corn oil and tallow, as stock for their biofuel production. And so they can compete with us for those fat sources, and it's driving the price up. And cattle feeders can't really afford or justify to feed fat at that price. And so what we've been looking at is alternative fat sources or feed additives that could improve fat digestibility. So we actually did some work in the feedlot looking at palm oil as a fat source. And the reason we looked at palm oil is because it doesn't qualify for that biofuel credit that other fat sources do. And so they can't compete with us for that fat source. And so we looked at feeding different types of palm oil in a feedlot finishing diet. And that was some really interesting research. There'll be some more coming down the line on that. There's been pretty limited research on palm oil and feedlot diets previously. So this has kind of become a hot topic, and I think we'll see some more research coming out of that area.
Very interesting. A lot of factors there that a person may not think about, such as how biofuels production and credits impact what cattle are being fed. And for all of our listeners, you might recall in our last episode, Andrew and I talked about some of those biofuels credits as we got into the alphabet soup of getting paid for biogas or even some other renewable fuels. So the dots really start to connect on some of these topics in the ag industry. It's all connected at the end of the day.
And on the topic of feed additives, they potentially can relate very directly to sustainability, and particularly enteric emissions, because we know enteric emissions are far greater than other emissions from manure, et cetera. We hear of things like seaweed as a feed additive. Does that even have a heartbeat in terms of the quantities required versus the impact on enteric emissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's been actually quite a bit of research on lots of different ways and lots of different feed additives to reduce methane emissions, seaweed being one of them. As far as the scale for production to do that, I probably could not speak to how much is produced and whether or not it's enough to mass feed that to the amount of cattle we feed in the United States. But there has been a lot of promising research with different seaweeds and algae, lots of feed additives that we know reduce methane. It just comes down to, does it price in and is it affordable for our producers to do it, especially if reducing methane doesn't exactly give them a return on their investment in any way unless they're being credited for methane reduction.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll put that one on a more to come, to be continued, because I think that people are going to continue to research this, and the methane emissions will continue to be monetized as we go forward, as the people in town are going to continue to want to see our so-called greenhouse gas emissions be decreased.
Yep. But there's another piece to that component too, is just the way that we manage cattle nutritionally without feed additives can also influence methane production. So back to my research with fat typically reduces methane emissions when we add it to the diet. So there's different things that you can do nutritionally with non-novel feedstuffs to also reduce methane emissions. And that's not something that I think people understand either, which, it makes sense. That's not in their wheelhouse, but we are able to do that with the resources we do have.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because as we look at the biomethane potential of manures, we're seeing more and more data relates very much to fat in manure. Lipids in manure translates directly to methane potential of that manure. So that all makes good sense.
Mm-hmm.
So
makes sense.
As we kind of round it out here, I've always kind of been a believer in the fact that people in agriculture, people in production, and I'll put cattle feeders in this category as I would dairy producers, et cetera, we're all really lousy at promoting ourselves, because people who just go to work every day and grind away, they don't think a lot about talking themselves up and promoting what they do and how good it is, the things that we're doing in production agriculture. So if you were to just give some words of advice to cattle producers, cattle feeders, or it could be large dairies or any large animal agriculture operation, could you give them some advice as far as how they should be carrying our message forward?
I think the biggest thing is just being open to having those conversations with people who are asking questions, and being very careful not to make assumptions when you have interactions with people, whether that's online or in person. Some people just have very genuine questions and want to know, and they're asking you because they've been told that you're the expert. And so I think it's important to be willing to have those conversations in the first place, but also the way that you approach those conversations, I think, is really important. They're coming to you in a vulnerable position where they're asking questions about things they don't know. It doesn't do any good to be condescending or assume or believe that they should know these things. I think being really, really kind in the way that you approach those conversations and being willing to answer any questions that they have in a way that doesn't belittle them or isn't condescending in any way is really important. And then that's going to allow them to trust you better and think that, okay, I can ask this person more questions and not feel ridiculed or condescended in any way.
Yeah, I think that's the best possible scenario, is if the people in town could, when they come directly to the producers and ask the questions, because I'd much rather have the people that are doing the work, or the people that are owning these operations, let them give sincere, accurate answers, as opposed to going to Professor Internet, and you just never know what you're going to get with that.
Absolutely.
Well, Anna, Brock and I would like to thank you for joining the herd today, and your information is incredibly valuable, whether it's non-ag people or to producers. And so we really would like you to continue to carry your message forward. And so in doing that, how can our listeners follow you?
Yeah. So I am on Instagram primarily as my main social media platform. So if you want to follow along, I talk about a lot of things related to cattle feeding, but also a lot of things related to ranching, taking you from the pasture to the feedlot and even to your plate sometimes. So my Instagram handle is just Anna M. Kobza, and that's it on Instagram. And then I do also have a TikTok account where I'm probably less active, but that's just at Anna Kobza as well.
Great. Well, I'm pretty confident that people will jump on and follow you, and we sure hope that they do. So again, thank you very much, Anna. And thank you to all of our listeners for being part of the herd today.